Guys, how are you? Welcome. What's going on? Welcome to Cereal at Midnight. My name is Heath, and in this episode, I want to talk to you about a book that I am reading right now. I'm in the middle of it as we speak. Teenagers and Teenpics: The Juvenilization of American Movies in the 1950s. Now, that's a scholarly name, and this is a scholarly book, but what it is the story of the teenage exploitation movie cycle of the 1950s. It's a big hit for me because I love the 1950s. I love those exploitation movies. We're talking about monster movies, right? We're talking about the Youth Gone Wild movies, Roger Corman, Sam Katzman, right? I love that particular style of movie. And this is it's really delving into the why that happened, how that happens, and then kind of an overview of the movies that did come out of that cycle. And it's super educational, which is, it should be, right? Because the author, Thomas Doherty, he's a big deal. He's a professor. He's an associate professor of American studies. Well, he was at the time of this. He's basically the chair of film studies at Brandeis University. He's a film historian. He's a scholar. And he's written several other books that are currently on their way to me right now because I'm having such a great time with this one. So I thought maybe we talk about this for just a few minutes. Maybe this is the first. I read a lot of books, right? I don't talk necessarily about books here on the channel as much as I should. So let's change that. Maybe this will be the first installment of the Cereal at Midnight Book Club or something like that. And you can join along if you want to. But I'm loving this book. Again, it's a fairly sociological based, like they're really getting into, he spent 50 pages or so talking about how they got to that point in the 50s, which that may sound boring to you, and if it is, then this ain't for you, Jack. But if it doesn't sound boring to you, this might be something that you're very interested in. I should also say it's not a new book. This particular printing was 2002, and it's I think that's a revised edition from a book that was published in 1988. But we're talking about a locked off period, right? We're talking about the 50s. So how did they get there, right? How did you get to that point? And he talks about, the boom coming out of the Great Depression and how the economy was in need of recovery after the Depression. So studios, producers, filmmakers, they start packaging, double features, giving you more product for less money. And then what the exploitation picture meant in the 40s, and exploitation at one point in time was just your big tent pole, your big Ten Commandments could arguably be I like to say that Ten Commandments is one of the most successful exploitation pictures of all time because Cecil B. DeMille really looking at what's in the Ten Commandments? It's sex, violence, romance. There's everything you want from any sort of a story. Yeah, it's from the Bible, right? But he's really leaning into it. It's a technicolor spectacle that Cecil B. DeMille is bringing to the screen in that. It's super exploitation. It's just expensive. Exploitation did not always mean super low budget. At one point in time, it just referred to anything that was feeding an audience's expectations that it would get them into the seat, right? Whatever gets those butts in seats. And there was adult-made movies for adults, romances and dramas and screwball comedies and stuff like that, eventually started to take a back seat, especially during the 1950s, because you've got the introduction of, it's not the introduction, but what really took off in the 1950s, television. That's right. The television dates back to the 40s, but by the 50s, it was, there's statistics in this book. It's like, 8 out of every 10 houses in the 1950s had a TV on for at least 5 hours and 10 minutes a day. I think that's the statistic. That's a lot. 8 out of 10 houses, and then for over 5 hours. So everyone's hovering around this box. So the theaters are like, well, we've tried to get these people to, urban migration. That's the whole the move to the suburbs too. Is the people leave the cities in the 40s and the 50s after World War II, right? They start migrating out to the suburbs where they're leaving the downtown theaters behind. And you would eventually have neighborhood theaters, but they weren't the same, they didn't draw the same numbers, the same size of crowds, we're talking about box office returns, really. They didn't make the money that they did, before people started to migrate to the suburbs. So how do these theaters get all these people back into the seats of those theaters? Exploitation movies, right? Start leaning on disaster pictures and the salacious stuff. At the same time that all this is happening, the ratings structure, the motion, that like the Hays Code, the Decency Police, the League of Catholic Decency, all these different organizations are starting to crumble because they no longer represent the values of a post-war America. We've seen things, we've done things, as I like to say. Like you can't put the toothpaste back in the container once it's out. So we're seeing all these institutions starting to crumble, and there's a hungry audience there that has never been there before, which is teenagers. Before the 1950s, teenagers did not factor into the decision of any market, really, not just movies, but like music markets. The teenage audience was not even thought about. They were either considered children or young adults. You were the children demographic or the young adult demographic, and there was nothing in between. But then they're starting to think and realize at this point in history that, well, hold on a second. Coming out of World War II in the late 40s into the 1950s, these teenagers, they've got money because of the economy. The economy grew consecutively for, I think it's 11 straight years with no loss, no shrinking of the economy, nothing but success, nothing but growth. And so we're talking about a generation that grew up under some of the most privileged circumstances in the last 100, but really ever. The car sales, the houses, the privileges, the disposable income of teenagers during the 1950s through the roof. And this book traces the sociological causes of that as well, which I think is fascinating, super interesting to me. That post World War II surplus of they have all this excess. The steel, the materials, everything's kind of a fine oiled machine, and it just, like everything elevates. Not everyone benefited, but statistically, most people did. More people did than did not. So what do? You make movies for this new audience. And what are the movies that you make? Well, you make movies that patronize what they want to see. Teenagers that have the power, teenagers that scare the adults, right? The monster movies, you're giving them drive-in movies where they can come watch cheap thrills. They can watch sex and violence. And then that leads to the cycle of the hippie movement of the 60s, the I think of the Wild Angels, and specifically, like, what do we want? We want to get loaded. That sort of thing. That's directly connected to the teenage movement of the 50s. But the teenagers of the 50s were still connected to their parents. They were the first generation that had been served like this. So you don't have necessarily the excess or the backlash against society that you have in later years. But yes, I could go on and on about this. Clearly, I'm super interested in it. But it's a fascinating book. Again, it's not written necessarily for a layman perspective. He is a professor. It feels like a college level course. But if you're interested in that and you haven't checked this book out yet, I highly recommend it. Let me go through some of the chapters here. I'm looking for the table of contents. I just passed it. So American movies as a less than medium. That's kind of talking about the decline of movies, just the product. What's interesting and kind of scary is the parallels between the 30s and 40s, the pre-war movie economy, and what we're living through right now, where the more interesting adult-oriented pictures, I'm calling them pictures now. I'm just leaning into the film critic in me, the film enthusiast. They're pictures. They're leaning the bigger, more adult-oriented, not bigger, but the more mature adult-oriented pictures are not getting the same views. They're not getting the same attendance as the big spectacle movies. So Hollywood just starts making big spectacle movies. And it's not that they're not making the other kinds of movies, but you have to work harder to see them. And then TV comes in, right? Substitute that for streaming, okay? TV comes in, and people are like, well, people aren't going to the movies anymore. They're staying home and watching television. So in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, like in the subject, in the era of what this is dealing with, these exploitation producers just start making all these movies to get people back into the theaters, but they're doing it fairly cheaply. You have the big, the Cecil B. DeMille movies, and then you've got the exploitation movies. And I'm like, now, do we have exploitation movies? I would say that we're in kind of a prudish place as far as thrills and, you know, what we will allow on our cinema screens. You know, we're in a very like morally offended period. Maybe that's just an echo. You know, we kind of went through some of this in the past as well. But I feel like the middle ground cinema has been lost to streaming and to the big Marvel movies and the DC movies, but there's precedent for all of it. It's all historical. These are all echoes of something that's already happened. Then we have a commercial history, the teenage marketplace, rock and roll teen pics. You know I'm there for that, daddy. Dangerous youth, the horror teen pics, the clean teen pics, generation after generation of teen pics. And, you know, what I would love to know is where, because this is the 2002 revision of this, where did this end up? You know, this book really ends when my interest in mainstream cinema declines. Like, I can directly correlate my decline of interest to about 2001, 2002. I think 9/11 had something to do with it. I think the economy had something to do with it. But I would love to know what the author thinks about where things went after that for the next 20 years. Because literally that's the era of the modern blockbuster and the tentpole that we have never seen the likes of. Going back to the Ten Commandments, Jack, that ain't got nothing on some of these billion-dollar superhero movies. The commitment by Disney to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where they're doing dozens of pictures that are all connected to each other. So there's opportunity for further exploration as well. But if you like 50s movies, if you like exploitation cinema, and you like to know where those things come from, you know, if you're a thinking person who likes to see and study the trends and see where they may be going, Teenagers and Teenpics is the book for you. And maybe this is the beginning of a further conversation about this stuff. When I'm done with it, I might make another video recapitulating what I've learned back in video form as an episode. But we'll see what happens. But I wanted to talk to you guys about it because I'm very much, as you can tell, I'm digging it. I'm all about it right now. So let's continue the conversation in the comments below. We can talk about, hey, here's a good jumping off place. What are some of your favorite 1950s teenage pics and exploitation movies of that era? For me, Corman, Sam Katzman, that sort of a thing. You know, just got the Cold War creatures. Can I reach? Yeah, it's right here. Just talked about Cold War creatures here, you know. There's so much. It's not necessarily teen movies either, but I think teenagers would have been interested. They were interested in that sort of stuff. All right, let's wind it down. Guys, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Take care. Until next time, here's where to go and what to do.